Good to see you. I have your
Well,
your new book here. This is very
oh,
exciting
right.
to talk about.
Okay.
Why don't we just jump into it?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so I feel you need no introduction, but maybe say a few lines about yourself, and then let's talk about your new book, Maurice Nicoll, Forgotten Teacher of the Fourth Way.
By way of a very brief introduction, my name is Gary Lachman. I'm a writer, and I've written quite a few books, biographies, also sort of general histories and studies of certain figures and philosophies in what we might call the Western esoteric tradition. And most recent one is a biography of a fellow named Maurice Nicoll, who most people don't know who he is, but he's actually quite an interesting figure.
What was it? I mean, I feel like we should jump off with just talking about who Gurdjieff was and what the Fourth Way is. But what was it about? This is a fairly obscure figure. So Maurice Nicoll, not Maurice. What was it about this guy that snagged you so much that you decided to write an entire book about him?
Well, actually, I was asked to write the book. There's a I guess what we call a backstory to this, the history we used to say, or just the story leading up to it. But yeah, it's a bit complicated. But a few years ago now, the fellow in the States who's quite keen on Nicoll and as a researcher and has written a thesis about him. He got in touch with me and he asked me would I be interested in writing a book about him. And I knew who he was because I've been interested in the Gurdjieff work and the Gurdjieff-Uspensky, it's the Fourth Way. We'll get into why it's called the Fourth Way later, perhaps. But
Right.
the other interesting thing was that Nicoll started out as a student of Jung, Carl Jung. He was Jung's leading British exponent in the early days of psychoanalysis, depth psychology. And then towards the end of his life, he got very interested in the work of Immanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Swedish savant, scientist turned religious mystic. And it turned out that I had written books about all three of these things. I've written biographies of Jung and Swedenborg and also of P.D. Uspensky, who was the person associated with the Gurdjieff work that Nicoll had the closest relationship with. So this fellow got in touch with me, asked me would I be interested in doing it, and I said, well, he's a niche figure, but you might the fact that he had these three as teachers, no one else has that I know of. So he had close personal contact with three pivotal figures in the early days, or at least the first half of the 20th century. Well, Jung lived in the early 60s. So I thought maybe I could find, some one of my publishers interested. But this fellow said, no, no, don't worry about that. He was going to take care of that, which was a strange thing. And so,
Hmm.
long story short, he wound up actually um, funding the research for it.
Oh, okay.
And he had
Not bad.
wanted, yeah, and he had wanted it to be published by a particular publisher in the States, but once they got a look at the actual book, which has some rather radical stuff in it, stuff that you might not associate with the esoteric teacher, I think they didn't know what to do with it, and so they basically declined publishing it. And I sent it to my other publisher, and they, oh yeah, of course. So they did it. So
What was
that's how
what
it
was so
came out.
radical? What was so radical that scared people
Well,
away?
well, how should we say it? One of the things that came out about Nicoll a few years ago, or around 2017, was another researcher here in the United Kingdom, up in Scotland. That's where he's from originally, Edinburgh. And he had come across a box of diaries of Nichols that hadn't been, no one had seen them. They were in the possession of one of his followers, a fellow named Sam Copley, who wrote a book about Nicoll. It came out, I think, it came out in the 70s, perhaps. Maurice Nicoll, The Vertical Man, a portrait. And the diaries are interesting, document, archival material, because they cover the first set cover like the years leading up to World War One and Nichols' involvement with Jung, and then later they cover period throughout the 40s through World War II up until just before his death in about 1953. But they're mostly a dream diary, and they're written in this very fragmentary way. So it's not a clear sort of narrative. It's kind of a mess, and there's a lot of kind of illusions and sort of symbolic language and different kinds of codes. But the thing that comes out is that he was obsessed with sex. And but as I say in the
That's
book,
hardly controversial these days.
well, for this fellow, this would have, because this is something that's never come out before,
Okay.
and although these diaries have been available up in the University of Edinburgh, only one or two sort of researchers have worked on them, and I knew nothing about this. So there was the fellow who basically got me, to write the book. He sent me 1,000+ page file of these diaries, and I mean they're real chore to read. And both he and the fellow up in Scotland, they both think, well, this is sort of on par with the Red Book because there is a lot of mystical and visionary things of that sort and
Yeah,
dream
I saw you said
interpretation.
that. You say that right in the beginning of the book, and that's a pretty amazing statement.
Well, in the sense that it deals with a lot of what you would call archetypal material. And as I ask in the book, I don't know for sure, but Nicoll knew Jung when Jung was going through the, depending on your point of view, the descent into the unconscious or the psychotic episode that gave birth to the Red Book. And so one wonders if Jung initiated him or shared with him what he was doing with active imagination, because a great deal of what is recorded or recounted in these diaries seems something like that, but of a sexual nature. And as I said, the odd thing is that it was a pursuit. It was something that he pursued with one hand, as if you know what I mean,
Yes.
which is an old, French definition for pornography. It's the kind of literature one reads with one hand. And this, I say this in the beginning of the book. I mean, when I had no idea there was anything like this. There's no evidence in any of his work, and he's rightly known for producing these 5 volumes of what are known as the psychological commentaries on the work of Gurdjieff and on teachings of Gurdjieff and Uspensky. And then his own speciality was this kind of esoteric Christianity. And a very short book called The New Man, and one that was unfinished called The Mark, where he interprets the Gospels and parables in the New Testament in from the point of view of esotericism, a la the sort of Gurdjieff system. Although he doesn't say that, specifically in the things itself. And so that was his. And there are many people that admire him and interested in his work for that way. And Swedenborg himself wrote this gigantic, Arcana Coelestia, interpretation of just the Genesis. I think the Book of Revelation. So um, but there's nothing to suggest in anything that out in the public about this fellow in any of his books or any of the couple books about him or accounts by students of his that the stuff that is recounted in the diary was happening.
Hmm.
And it's as I said to the fellow who wanted me to do this. I said, do you really, does the family really want this stuff available? And do you? I mean, I know you're very keen on Nicoll, and you want to sort of make him more well known and blah blah blah. And I think I agree that he a new study of him would be worthy because already having Gurdjieff and Uspensky and Jung as teachers, but all of this stuff, this is the first thing people are going to start think of, like, what's this all about? But I went ahead and did it. And I mean, their idea is that it was in this kind of tradition of sacred sexuality and tantra, and it is, but it's also because fundamentally, he put it simply, he basically uses masturbation, or is what we would call self-sex. I don't know what the proper term is for it these days, but
Self-abuse.
so whatever, what we're all told we're not supposed to do, but which we nudged do in the dark anyway. Just like people like Crowley and others were using for magical, sort of purposes. He was using it to create these kind of exalted states, and then he had these sort of visionary dialogues with this kind of eternal feminine. but it was also the dark side as well. So there's the Madonna whore, and again, this is you have to put yourself back into the early, it's 100 years ago, or when the diary started. It's earlier than that. Nicoll himself came from a Scottish Presbyterian background, so he was brought up in this very dour, sin-ridden religion. And his father was this alpha male kind of political religious figure in the early 20th century, he was friends with the young Winston Churchill and Lord Asquith and all of this kind of stuff. So he was writing newspaper columns all the time and books and this kind of thing. And Maurice was a more sensitive, introverted kind of boy. He had an artistic side, but he also had a kind of hands-on mechanical sort of side, which worked out for him well when got involved with the Gurdjieff work. So a lot of that involves actually kind of what we might call arts and crafts, used for sort of meditative purposes, and so on and so on. But he I get the impression he grew up with the kind of low self-esteem, what we would call low self-esteem these days.
Hmm.
But these diaries also have this remarkable document, it's an essay he didn't finish, just called Unclean Thoughts. And this is about, from early on, his association of kind of what we would call transgressive kind of fantasies, sexual fantasies, with his deep religious yearning. And they were somehow associated in some way. And in the sense that both of them held out the promise of a more intense kind of life rather than the everyday lukewarm, pedestrian life that we all have to occupy. And he was driven by many, like many figures, who pursue this sort of thing, by a kind of hunger for something of a more intense kind of experience of life. And this drove him to Jung, this drove him to Gurdjieff, but it also was at the heart of this kind of sexual fantasy and obsession he had from very early on. And it's a remarkable document because I think he kind of hits the nail on the head for kind of male sexual fantasies, and again, it's not like he's a fetishist in this particular thing. It's not like one thing he goes back to all the time. It's a general, almost like philosophical kind of. He's trying to understand why these kinds of thoughts have obsessed him from early on, and there's no indication that he ever did anything in the sense of with any of his students or followers. There's nothing like that whatsoever. So it's all something that was kind of
Hmm.
self-contained.
It's interesting you bring up Crowley, and I'm curious about kind of the core of what Nicoll is talking about, but how you would relate it to fellow travelers like Crowley, or I suppose William Blake earlier, or Ida Craddock, or Paschal Beverly Randolph, or people like this. Is there kind of like a overlap there, or is it a very unique take that he has?
Well, he doesn't really talk about those people. He doesn't know. He might
I
have
mean
known
more in
about
I mean more in your opinion, not his.
um well, I'm not that familiar. I mean, I'm familiar with Crowley.
Hmm.
I'm not.
Okay.
I know Pascal Berry Randolph and Craddock, but I'm not that familiar with their work and lives to be able to compare them. But I would say the thing, in some ways he's trying to do the same thing that Crowley's doing, um, but he feels guilty about it.
Hmm.
So he often has kind of hangovers. So it's kind of like he doesn't know if this is going to end in a hangover. Is this going to end in a sense of exalted, self transcendence? It's because sometimes it does. Other times because I mean, even though think about Crowley always he's always going on about how he has to burn the shame out of himself and all this kind of
Hmm.
thing. And that's his kind of
Yeah, 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 yeah.
go-to reason for why I'm doing this now. And it's like,
Right,
well,
right, right.
but Alistair, man, you did that the last 25 times. I mean, how much shame do you have? You know what I mean? It's just like, oh yes, they must once more, it's
The
just like, oh
Puritan
no,
upbringing.
you just like doing this. This is something you just like doing.
Yeah.
It's fine, but don't come up with lots of reasons, to
Yeah,
make it
yeah,
sound
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah. That's
okay.
very funny. That's very
And
funny.
that's true of many others. I mean, even somebody like Michel Foucault, the French
Hmm.
philosopher, who went to S&M clubs and all that kind of thing, and then he writes this, highly obscure, very convoluted kind of meta history of the West in order to explain why you should let me just do what I like to do and not condemn me for it. You want to say, but Michelle, just do it, you know.
Right,
But
right.
at any case, I'll probably get a lot of trouble for that. But Nicoll, it's again, it's a battle. It's a battle between him and this. I mean, the thing is, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about this, but it is
Okay, okay.
fascinating. But no, but I'm saying it is, but it's
Hmm.
because it adds a whole other dimension. You know, I mean, you could have written a book. Okay, he knew Jung, he knew Spensky, he knew Gurdjieff, he did this, taught the work, and he could have explained all that. But that would have been just another book about these guys' ideas. So I sort of like what's going on behind him, and raise questions like, well, at a time had many followers isn't quite the right word, but students, at one point, and he lived in these different communities outside of London, kind of early off the grid kind of communities. So, but at one point he had like hundreds of people, coming on the weekends and all that. So, a lot of people respected him and saw him as a kind of spiritual guide in some ways. So you have to ask the question, well, that's going on. At the same time, there's this other secret,
Right.
going on in his closet and all that kind of thing. But the thing with it is like with Blake. I mean, but Blake too. As far as we know, he didn't get very far. I mean, Catherine didn't go for the idea of like sleeping with a maid. So, but Swedenborg too. He's one of the figures that Nicoll became fascinated with later on in life. And if you know the book "Why Mrs. Blake Cried" by Marcia Keith Souchard, and she goes into Swedenborg's whole exploration of a sacred sexuality and what he calls passive potency and kind of maintaining erection for X hours or whatever. But this is involved with these visionary states in which he went to heaven and hell. And going back to tantra and all that. I mean, we know there's a connection between all this kind of thing. Um, Nicoll doesn't really talk about it so much, but he that in that sense, he doesn't really talk about tantra. Doesn't really talk. He doesn't really explore it per se. It's his own. It's very very personal. His own kind of thing going on. So, um, but and the other side of it that or what I found helpful and trying to understand what he was doing and to see it in a creative light, not just say, oh my God, this guy, blah, blah, blah. There was a book Colin Wilson wrote in the early 60s. And, he's someone I've been very influenced by.
Yeah, yeah.
And he wrote a book called Origins of the Sexual Impulse. And it's a kind of phenomenology of the male sexual impulse. And I think it's still a very highly readable and very, important book. But fundamentally, he says he starts the book out by saying, well, like, what we talk about sexual perversions, but what actually is a sexual perversion? Well, to understand what a sexual perversion is, we need to know what unperverted sex is, like what's natural sex. But we don't really know what that
Is
is.
there such an animal? Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Tolstoy said it's for procreation, and any sex that's not for procreation is just decadent indulgence. But most of us aren't Tolstoyans. We don't. Is it for the betterment of the race? Well, oftentimes, Nights to Remember by two geniuses do not produce further geniuses. So it has something much more to do with our own individual development in some way,
Yeah, yeah.
with something to do with our total being.
Hmm.
That Nietzsche says, a person's sexuality rises up to the heights of their spirit. I'm paraphrasing him. And the Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev, he says we can think of ourselves as sexual beings, but we wouldn't think of ourselves as digestive beings in the sense that sex is not a physiological process in the same way that our digestive system is. And so this suggests that, and this is what the point Wilson makes, we talk about sexual appetite, but it's a curious appetite because it's the only appetite we have that can be satisfied purely through the imagination.
That's a really
Because if
interesting
you're
point. That's really
because
interesting.
if you're
Yeah.
hungry
Yeah.
and you imagine whatever it is, a
Interesting.
steak or a vegan buffet, they won't satisfy your hunger. It even they'll just make you more hungry.
That's a really profound comment. I feel like that
Yeah.
touches on something really deep, what you just said.
Well, I mean, I think this is important. I try to spell this out, and Wilson says, I mean, odd as it sounds, the fact that we can have the exact same physiological response to a completely imaginary um, trigger says that sex has something much more to do with the mind than it does with the genitals. Even though it has with the genitals, but if you know what I'm saying, um, and this is something that that's a lens that I use to look at what Nichols doing, because that's what he did. He indulged in basically imaginary sex uh, as a means of well, I mean, yes. Again, this is the tussle. Am I doing this? And the other thing is some of the dialogues he has with this internal, eternal feminine. She's basically saying, "You got to get over this."
Hmm.
You're. He had some reticence about actually approaching women out in the world. It's a very strange thing. So I think it had a lot to do with his bringing up. His upbringing, his Presbyterian, his alpha male father. It's kind of cool. In fact, when he met Jung, um, Jung worked with him to cure him of the stutter he had, and the stutter he had came from being intimidated by his father all the time and not being able to speak in
Okay.
front of him, because his father was this bellowing kind of, imagine a guy like smoking all the time and throwing newspapers and it's
Yeah.
like and whatever, and his children are just kind of milling around him and all that, and so um I mean the thing if just okay, here's the phenomenology of it. Here's okay. Think about Playboy Centerfold. I don't know if these things still exist or not, but when I was a kid,
It's
that was
very
the thing. Get a
nostalgic.
hold,
Yeah.
get a hold of a copy of Playboy, right?
It seems so innocent now.
In reality, it's just a two-dimensional, flat, two pieces of paper, right, with some, images on it. That's what it is in reality. But I can, through this magic I have of I can bestow upon it reality through my imagination, enough reality where I could have the exact physiological response that I would have with the real thing. And I said before, that won't happen with food, won't happen with drink. You can imagine, oh, you're thirsty, imagine this glass and this little drops of moisture coming down the side. That just makes you more thirsty.
Hmm.
So the whole idea is like, what is this? What happened? How do I bestow reality upon this thing? And Wilson's point is like, okay, if I can do that, my imagination can do that to a flat two-dimensional image, make it more, make it as real than the real, as real as the real thing. Um, what if I, you know, direct that attention to something that already is real? Well, okay, well, then we're with the poets and the mystics, because they're seeing the tree or the flower or the stars or the clouds or whatever like that. It's not too, it's the way we always see it, but then they're adding another.
Hmm.
And again, when I say add, I don't want to impute that the meaning isn't really there. It is there, but it needs, we need to apply, Wilson calls it intentionality. I don't want to go too much into that in phenomenology, but we need to apply a certain kind of mental act to it in order to bring out its reality. So in a way, when as a kid, I was reacting to a Playboy centerfold. I was performing some kind of profound, phenomenological act, bestowing reality upon something. And then, when you're a poet or mystic, you're doing the same thing, but it's not for sexual purposes, or we could say it's a kind of cosmic eroticism.
Well,
I mean,
there would also be the
yeah, yeah.
magical approach rather than the mystical approach would be directing that energy to something that is not yet real.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say imagination. We always say imagination is about make believe. No, it's about make real.
I love that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I always
Think,
point
think
out to
what.
people every single thing that we take for granted as real started other than the purely natural world began in the imagination first, whether it's cars or a novel or your self-image. So,
Or just think what the word realize means. You knew something, then you realize. Oh, I realized. Oh, I didn't realize. What this? You didn't make it real. That's what that means. You did not realize it. And then again, so that's all. That's tied into these moments of peak experiences or mysticism or something where the content of the experience is really no different than the content of everyday experience, but you've realized it, you've seen it. Kathleen Rains says, imagination doesn't see different things, it sees things differently.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you see it from a different sort of angle. So in any case, I use this lens of Wilson's kind of phenomenology, the male sexual impulse, to try and understand what Nicoll is doing. And also, the key thing to triggering the imagination, at least for males in this context, is the forbidden. It goes back to Adam, Eve, and the kids. Like to transgress, to go beyond, to break. But this kind of thing is Nicoll associates with his religious impulses. This is spiritual because it's to penetrate into the unknown.
Yeah, one
The
technical
sexual
point.
penetration and penetration into the unknown realms of reality and
Yeah, I
things of
mean,
that
one
sort. Yeah.
one one thing I was going to bring up that I was thinking about as you were saying is when you're talking about Nicoll, it seems like a lot of these acts were very taboo for him and probably would not be taboo at all for modern people. So the question there is the energetic charge coming from the act itself or the breaking of the taboo?
Well, I think it still is. I mean, we trick ourselves. We still want to go have a dirty weekend, even though we know sex isn't dirty. It's just everyday life, and it's part of health and five a day or whatever. You know what I mean? It's all that sort of thing. But we still because precisely because the forbidden, the taboo adds a spice, which is what sexual perversions do. And I'm just calling them that because that's what what do you want to call it? Sexual embellishments. We don't have to
Okay.
call it perversions. It adds a certain kind of piquant spice. But the point of that is to basically increase your grasp of what is going on. The forbidden, whatever it might be, triggers your imagination, and that produces I said imagination is not about make believe, it's about make real. Suddenly, oh, this is real now, and you're really excited in having the sex or whatever it might be. Whatever things might do. But the whole point of that is the focus is you're focusing. The lure of the forbidden is a trigger to focus the imagination. It's to focus the mind and all that. And if we could do that, um, we wouldn't need the embellishments to keep us interested in it. But we could also direct that, I said, not only in those cases, but to other things as well.
Hmm.
And when you can focus your directed attention at something or direct your focused attention at something, you suddenly see it in a different way. That's when you're seeing things poetically or mystically or aesthetically.
Yeah, I mean that definitely resonates with the things Crowley was saying, or even things like people like Napoleon Hill were saying. And this is something that is much more in common currency and culture, but still something that you see people kind of adopt and then shy away from, and then adopt a little bit again later, and then shy away from, and
Mm.
kind of weaves in and out of the culture. But what I was going to ask is just the fact that this guy has a through line through Gurdjieff, Jung, and Swedenborg, that's a big deal. And I'm curious, I mean, those three, can be endless talks on their own, but I'm curious in what the through line he found was, and if that was related to this kind of sexual view of things, or if that was his own addition.
Mm. Um, Well, he initially became interested in Jung in the early days of psychoanalysis in England. So he started out, and he was what they call a GP here, general practitioner, just a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But then he became interested in what was happening in Vienna, Freud, and Zurich with Jung. So he basically asked his father, said, can you fund my going over there for a while? I'd like to do this. This is what I'd like to devote my life to. And so his father did that. So he went over and he spent time with Jung. He didn't meet Freud, but he studied with some of Freud's followers in Vienna, and he became very convinced. He became converted to psychoanalysis. And in the early days, it was like wasn't yet the Freud Jung kind of rivalry didn't happen just yet.
Hmm.
But increasingly, he found himself more drawn to Jung's ideas because they were more positive. And he wrote one of the first books, if not the first book in English, about Jungian psychology, dream psychology. It's just called, this book just called Dream Psychology. And it's kind of sidelined. The Jungians don't know about it. And the people that generally know about it are people in the Gurdjieff work of the Fourth Way, because it gets mentioned. But when they go to it, there's nothing about that in it. So what it is a very interesting, slim, very clean, clear written book about the differences between Jung's ideas about dreams and Freud's. And the main idea is like Freud wants to know where dreams are coming from, and Jung wants to know where they're going to. That's the
Okay,
simplest
interesting.
simplest sort of thing.
Interesting.
So Freud wants to find out what's the source. And he's coming 19th century, the source of the Nile, all that kind of thing. It's like the source, there's the source, this is where it just started. It's like, yeah, that's it. All this stuff, whatever your unconscious, repressed ideas. And the dream is a camouflage to which that just strikes me in the beginning. That should just like, should say, hold on a second. The dream is a camouflage to allow me to have a good night's sleep. So because it disguises what my secret desires are. But I don't always have a good night's sleep. So it's like
Right.
that's not
Well,
really
wouldn't you want to know
working.
what your secret desires are? I
Well,
mean,
no,
wouldn't you
we
want
don't, because I want to sleep with my mother, I want to kill my
to
father, or
speak for
whatever,
yourself?
Well, I'm saying that's what. Yeah, there you go, there you go. It's you denial. You're in denial
Well, but
here
although
and all that.
it has been, a lot of people have said that Freud had just projected his own kind of repressive,
Oh,
German
yeah,
upbringing
yeah, yeah, yeah,
to
yeah. I mean, yeah,
universalized it. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
a little
yeah. I mean, yeah. I
skeptical
mean,
about that.
yeah, whether I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying
Right, right,
this is
right.
the general idea. But with Jung, it's saying no. The dream isn't. It's not hiding anything. It speaks in a symbolic language. It doesn't speak
Right.
in the literal sequential language of everyday logic. It speaks in a symbolic language, a metaphoric language, language of imagery, an analogy, and things of that sort. And it it's the unconscious wanting to become conscious. So the unconscious wants to become conscious for Jung. Okay.
Right.
For Freud, the unconscious likes to be conscious, but we don't want it to be conscious because we're afraid of what we will find out about ourselves, and so
That's
we
really
hide
interesting
it.
because I at some point picked up the, kind of like a deep definition of psychoanalysis is revealing the contents of the unconscious to the conscious, but you've just defined it like a very deep division on that.
Well, I mean that's the cure in Freud. You're made to see this is what you really want, but initially you don't. No, 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 I don't.
Okay.
I don't want that. I don't want that. No, that's and I want to sleep with my mother. No, please, or whatever it might be. But then you have to be shown. No, this is just this. This is what it is, and blah 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 blah.
Hmm.
But with Jung, it's not like it's could be you are actually a poet, and you're living this life as a businessman all the time, and it's completely inhibiting and repressing your potential and all that, and your dreams are indicating this and some whatever. That's just an example. So the dreams for Jung, it's what he called the prospective tendencies. It's and this is like an early articulation of what would later on in some ways become kind of synchronicity or notions of conscious projecting itself into the see how the world, but that's down the line. So Nicoll, right, so he's writing that book, and he's in the very early days of and again, if people are interested in this, early days of depth psychology, psychoanalysis in England. So you have Ernest Jones, who was Freud's bulldog. He's the guy who writes the big biography, and he wants to have just a completely Freudian British psychoanalytic association. So he wants to get rid of all the Jungians. He wants to cut
Okay.
off the Jungian rump. So there's all this kind of infighting in there and all that going on. And then Nicoll goes and stays with Jung a few times. And one time he's there, this is when the eruption has happened. And Jung's gone through, if you know the whole story, we said these visions he's on a train to Sachsenhausen or somewhere like that, and he sees this flood coming over Europe, and the Alps protect Switzerland, but everywhere else it's just debris and carnage and so on and so on. He thinks he's going out of his mind, and he realizes these are precognitive visions of World War One.
Ah, okay.
Um,
Okay.
and so I mean, World War One breaks off Nicoll's studies with Jung, and he winds up being, as an officer, a doctor, being sent to Mesopotamia, and he actually
Whoa.
winds up writing a. Oh, you talk about being
Wow.
120, in Texas, that was that there, with
It's a
um,
big change of scenery from before. That's insane.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, he was living in my neighborhood, leafy Hampstead in green North London.
Yeah,
Suddenly
that's a
he's in
big yeah.
Mesopotamia. He's dealing with people that are they're heat stroke, just horrible injuries and all that, and it's so he's dealing. But interestingly enough, one of the sort of motifs I play with in the book is that a lot of Nicoll, when he finally found himself in the Gurdjieff work, he said everything before my life has led up to this. So he Gurdjieff work. But funnily enough, if you, as I do in the book, you look at his experiences in Mesopotamia with what he had to do there. Like, he had to put together quick ramshackle, jerry-rigged, hospitals in order to deal with, injured soldiers and all that. And that's exactly the sort of stuff he was doing. Similarly, when he got involved with Gurdjieff work and Gurdjieff's Institute in France, where they're like, it's all building things really quickly, putting up a dance hall, and all this kind of construction going on with them, everything at top speed in this kind of crisis situation. Gurdjieff, he was a master of creating artificial crisis and purposeful inconvenience. Put it that way, creating situations that just were impossible to deal with, but you were forced to deal with them, and that
Mm.
broke you out of your everyday habitual sense of self and limitation,
So this is something
and awakened to other levels of energy that you didn't know you had.
yeah, that's something that I'm curious about that because that's something you hear about always with Gurdjieff, like the Gurdjieff and shock. But I'm curious about, are there do you know specific stories about him? What did he like when he actually did that? What did he do? What did it look like? And what did he or do you have
Oh,
salacious stories?
there's many accounts of descriptions of stuff that went on there. I mean, the stop exercise is the famous one, which is like, it's kind of like, what they used to, when I was a kid, there was a game called Statues. You were doing, somebody said stop, and you had to
Right.
stop, stay in the position you were in,
Oh,
right?
that's
That's
great.
what
So he would just do that
he
with
would do
people.
that. So, but
That's
it would
great.
be
I
like
like that.
you would not know, so in the midst of, say, 50 people, this big old rundown chateau in the forest of Fontainebleau, uh, uh, you know, mowing the lawns, building this kind of study hall that was a place where they would later perform these sacred dances, the Gurdjieff movements. Just an enormous amount of physical labor going on, and then people like Nicoll, when he was there, he was given the job of kitchen boy, and that meant that he had to get up at about 3:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, get all the fires going. Again, this is in a rundown place. There's no, very little electricity, nothing, nothing, just like in Mesopotamia. And he had to cook for like 50 people, at 6 in the morning, whatever, like that. So it's, this is a guy who was hanging out. He was a kid. Winston Churchill was like, he was on Winston Churchill's knee or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
So, and but then Gurdjieff, stop.
That's brilliant.
And I'd have to be like this until he said, okay. And this, one poor soul took a drag of a cigarette, and the stories of the smoke, curling up through his eyes.
Oh,
Somebody else
he had
said,
it
pick,
frozen. He had it frozen in his
yeah,
mouth.
hey,
The
the
cigarette.
cigarette, just stop. That's it. No matter what.
Wow.
And somebody else had, just picked up a hot, mug of tea like that, and this had to hold it while it was hot. And all. So, I mean, that's just one of many of the things. And there's all these, different sort of psychological exercises, self-remembering, his the central, like, Gurdjieffian idea is that we believe we're awake and we're not.
Right.
The state consciousness that we accept as waking state is actually not as awake as it could be. And we don't really remember our existence. We don't really remember that we actually exist.
Yes.
We know that we do. We know that we do, but we somehow take it for granted and we don't feel that we exist. And in these rare moments when it comes to us that we actually do exist, it's actually again, this is again, we know we exist, but we don't realize we exist.
Yeah.
And we finally do. It's like, oh my God.
I
So I mean, there's lots more there, but that's kind of the central kind of theme.
one of the probably actually the first book I ever read on I'm sure you'll resonate with this. The first book I ever read on the esoteric that actually made me take it seriously because I was very cynical was The Occult by Colin Wilson. And it's a classic. And in that book he talks about Gurdjieff and Crowley and kind of sets them up in a little bit in opposition, but I think at least at that time in that book, he felt that Gurdjieff was a purer or higher transmission than Crowley. And Gurdjieff is not somebody that I've really talked about on the podcast ever. So I'd love to
Hmm.
just maybe um, do like a quick boilerplate. I mean, you've just
All
described the
right,
core
sure.
that you've just described
Yeah.
the core idea, but maybe do a quick boilerplate on that. And what is the fourth way? And I'm curious also, these days I'm less impressed with the PR of these various spiritual systems or the stories. And I look at, okay, well, what are the product, people who went through that, what are they like on the other side? And I'm not sure I've met a lot of Gurdjieff people or
Hmm.
possibly, I mean, I met John Shirley, but I can't, but I'm kind of curious if there's stories
Hmm.
about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was involved in the Gurdjieff work for a few years in New York and Los Angeles in the
Okay.
early 1980s.
Talk about
Uh,
that. So stories, firsthand stories are the crack cocaine of podcasts. So talk about that, please.
I had some remarkable experiences in it. I first well, I was introduced to. I mean, there's all these kind of bogus. So there for a while there was something called the Gurdjieff-Uspensky Centers, and they became known as the people of the bookmark, because whenever you went to like any bookshop that sold this kind of stuff and you picked up a book by Uspensky or Gurdjieff, one of the bookmarks would be in it. So they were sort of like a bogus one, but there's the real McCoy is the Gurdjieff Foundation, and this was started in the early 1950s after Gurdjieff died. Uspensky died in 47, Gurdjieff died in 49. Nicoll died in 53. And Jean de Salzman, who was one of Gurdjieff's closest students, she started this the Gurdjieff Foundation. So round about 1980, 81, I met someone, I knew someone who was involved in this, and I was introduced to a fellow named Paul Reynard, who's actually turned out to be one of the sort of lead performer of the Gurdjieff movements. And I don't know if you've seen this film. There was a film made called Meetings with Remarkable Men. It was a film based on this autobiographical book of Gurdjieff. It came out in the 70s. Um, uh, and it, it it's kind of a dry film, but Terrence Stamp is in it when he
Yeah.
gets up.
Great
You
actor.
actually, it comes alive.
Phenomenal
Peter
actor.
Brook. Peter Brook did it, who did the
Okay.
Mahabharata,
Yeah, yeah.
and he tends to
That's
use
great.
non-professional actors and all that. So it has a
I gotta
kind of
watch that. That's a
it's
star
it's it's
studded
probably on
crew there.
YouTube.
Okay.
It's worth, but there's scenes in the film where these dances are performed, and the stories that Gurdjieff learned of them in his journeys through Central Asia, where with other people of a group he called the Seekers of Truth, and he came upon this hidden monastery, much like Man Blavatsky's hidden monastery in Tibet, but this one was in Central Asia, and this was the monastery of the Sarmung Brotherhood, and that's where he learned these dances, and they're electrifying. They're like they're just mesmerizing kinds of things, and so when I first got involved in it, this fellow Paul Reynard, who was one of the leaders in that film of the dances, he was the group leader of the group I was meeting with. And no, I had some interesting experiences and learned certain different sorts of, exercises of sensing yourself and self-remembering and things of that sort. And then wound up going to Los Angeles. I relocated to Los Angeles, and then I got involved there on a bit more of a level, in the sense of you would have these work weekends where you would go out, a house in the valley. If you know LA, the valley is
Yeah. I
the
lived
other
in
side
LA
of the
for
hills.
11. Yeah, I lived in LA for 11
All
years
right,
before moving to
all right.
Texas.
So it's the Chandler on the other
Yes,
side of the
yes.
hills.
The
So
endless
over
valley.
that over that way,
Speaking of
and
places that are 120 degrees, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you go there very early and you spend all day me doing a variety of different sort of physical exercises. It wasn't so much putting a place, getting it up in order like the chateau, but there would be like I was painting a fence or like beating rugs, or you did handcraft sort of things. And you'd be given a certain exercise during the day, to be aware of yourself. I mean, I guess today it goes by the generic name of mindfulness, which is like it's the trickle down effect. This was stuff, 50 years ago, it was on the fringe. Now it's become kind of just like much else, I would say,
Hmm.
in our contemporary culture. Stuff that used to be
Hmm.
on the fringe has now become very much, dead center sort of thing, without the transformative effect we were all hoping it to
Right.
have.
Yeah, sadly. Although, yeah.
But so yeah, so that would happen, and then you do that, and then later in the day there'd be a lunch, that kind of thing, and then there'd be someone would give a talk, but it was always very much hands-on, very practical. And one of the things, it was the Gurdjieff treatment would be basically to create frustration, and you would have to deal with it. So there's a story about one of the people who went to Gurdjieff's uh, Institute of the Harmonious Development of Man, in the chateau in Fontainebleau, was the literary editor A.R. O'Reilly, who was the editor of a journal called The New Age back in the 19 teens and 20s. He discovered Catherine Mansfield, who actually went to the prairie as well, and wound up dying there from tuberculosis. She already had it. She didn't catch it. She had already had it. She was hoping Gurdjieff might be able to cure her. But in any case, he tells a story when he first goes there. He's given a shovel and told to dig. Now he's a large man but portly. He's a heavy smoker. He was forbidden to smoke, and he was just told to dig and dig and dig. And then after a while, dug this hole, and they said, "No, no, fill the hole up." And fill the hole up. And he next day just dig. He was just told to do this repeatedly, and it's like, have I gotten myself into? But finally, at one point, when he thought, I just can't do this anymore, screw this, he just pushed himself one more, and bang, he suddenly hit this other reservoir of energy, and he enjoyed the digging, and he couldn't wait to
Interesting.
dig more. And this was sort of the technique, was to push you past your limits. And I had not quite, the same intense treatment, but something similar. I was told to paint this fence, this long kind of, fence along this thing. And it's like, oh, I finished it and all that, the first coat, and I was really happy looking at it. And he said, oh, it's not the right color. No, 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 I don't think so. No, that won't do it all. No, sorry. And then it's like, your first reaction is, oh, okay, I'm getting the orage treatment here now. Okay. And so, you learn to deal with that.
So
And then,
did you expect that going in? Because I feel like
well,
if you didn't see that
I
coming,
kind of knew,
yeah,
but I laughed because I said, oh, yeah,
yeah,
this is
okay.
it. This is it. Okay, I got it. Okay, this is it. And then but I remember my thing was raking up the leaves, picking up all the leaves and all this kind of thing. And I remember at one point just picking this leaf up and having that moment where it's like, yep, this is the first time I've looked at a leaf. I've never seen a leaf before. This is absolutely fat. I had
Mm,
that kind of moment.
mm,
That's
mm.
the mystical kind of thing.
Interesting.
But also, I remember once, when I came to try to learn the movements, they're very, very difficult. I mean, it's this kind of thing, but with every other part of your body doing something else to music that keeps pushing you, and all that, and you have to keep to this kind of clockwork, regimen and all that. In any case, there was some complicated new, set of them, and I just couldn't do it. And I kept trying, so I just can't do this. I'm going to sit this one out. And then I just one more time, okay, I pushed myself, and bang, um, that what Gurdjieff called the accumulator. We have, again, it's metaphoric language, but we have a kind of accumulator in it, which basically it's a fuel tank. It holds our fuel, and there's a small one that we use all the time, and we get around most of it. But there's a bigger one that we don't touch that one that often, and we don't even know it's there.
That's
But
really interesting.
when
Yeah.
we're pushed, and what I later came to understand, and this came from mentioned Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, and he also did a little book about Gurdjieff called The War Against Sleep. But he makes an interesting connection between this whole system, this kind of frustration, that to push you beyond your ordinary limits, to the phenomenon of second wind, the athletes
Sure.
have. And there's a fantastic essay by William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist, called The Energies of Men. And he talks about this, and he says we basically live subject to degrees of fatigue which we have come only by habit to obey. And he tells the story of what they used to call these neurasthenic patients, people like, well, I simply can't make an effort to, and I can't get out of bed. I know I can't do this. No, no, no. And you can't get away with it now. But James called it the bullying treatment. And you would force them to get out of bed and do
Yeah.
something. And
Yeah.
suddenly everything became child's play. They were painting the flat. I mean, they were doing whatever. So it's like we become subject to this kind of accretion of a kind of habit of
Yeah.
like you can only do so much. And then
Yeah.
Gurdjieff's method, I would say, what he consciously induced second wind in people. He didn't think, he didn't call it that, but I don't think it matters what you call it. He knew. And did he really go to the Sarvan Brotherhood? I don't know, but it's a wonderful window dressing, and it's fantastically romantic, and it gives people a story behind what they're doing, right? Yeah, so I don't know whether that's true or not. No one's ever going to know,
Huh.
but I know from my own personal experience when I try to do these, and I bang, I just want to get my car and
Yeah.
drive to San Francisco and back, just for the fun of it. That's what I felt like. I just like woo, just wanted to
Yeah.
roll up the PCH and that sort of thing. So this
That's
we
great.
know. I'm remembering it now, talking to you about it, but we tend to forget it.
Yeah, no, I that when you explain it that way, it's so that's the clearest I've ever heard anyone explain it, and it makes perfect sense, and it resonates with tons of experiences that I've had in other, even in like something like a Tony Robbins seminar or something. He pushes that, or in a 10-day meditation retreat, or getting a book contract that takes 4 years to write. It's like that really pushes you, um,
Hmm.
and it raises the one of the things about you say the bullying treatment or pushing people past their comfort zone. Um, is this, it's like, I think sometimes, or the, even if kind of tantric crazy wisdom thing, I think sometimes it's like, yeah, I don't know if this thing is going to be even possible to do anymore in the current climate. Like the idea of giving people the bullying treatment or pushing them past their comfort zone is so anathema to where people's minds are at right now, which I suppose makes it even more potent, possibly. But I don't know if someone's going to be in business for very long if they're doing that type of thing on a consistent basis.
Well, you can do it. You can do it to yourself.
Sure.
And there's the other side of it too. I mean, I mean, there's how should you say, there's that side where you push beyond, and the other side is where you slow down and focus on something intently. And Wilson always quotes this line from Hermann Hesse's little slim um, symbolic novel, The Journey to the East. He says, "A long time devoted to small details exalts us and increases our strength."
Hmm.
And this is the context for HH. If I don't know if you know the story, but HH, that's the initials of the figure. He's someone who he belonged to the journey to the League. There's something called the League. There's something Hesse wrote in the 30s, and it's a symbolic novel. So it's a poetic novel. It's not realistic. But this fellow named HH Herman Hesse, Harry
Hmm.
Haller. So many of Hesse's characters are just him. And he was a member of the League, and the League is a spiritual league, and they were always on their journey, home, Heimat, and all that. But then he discovers that he's lost his way or something like that. In any case, but that's kind of the story. But he explains that he was in charge of the music for the group, and that entailed a great deal of kind of tight focused kind of work. And he said a long time devoted to small details exalts us and increases our strength. And this is the sort of thing too. You can push yourself beyond your what Wilson calls the robot through kind of sudden
Yeah.
shock treatments, or you can slow down. You can force it to slow down. So that's the meditative approach.
Yeah, now you should
Yeah.
just now I feel like just take someone's smartphone away for about a week and see how they cope. It's probably
Well, there you go. I mean, this is the thing about Crowley. Crowley knew this, even though he was a jerk in so many ways. He knew this. That's the story with Jane Wolfe, the
Hmm.
Hollywood actress and the Charlie Chaplin era Hollywood actress who winds up at Cefalu, the
Mhm.
Abbey. And as soon as she gets there, he realizes that she's suffering from too much bathtub gin and barbiturates or whatever they were taking back then. Her nerves were shot, and he says, "What you have to do is you have to, I will set you up in a lean-to up on this side of the mountain here, and that this boy will come and bring you some bread and grapes and water every day, and you just sit there." And she says, "What the? I came here away from Hollywood. And you want me to go sit?"
That's great.
Oh, you can go back to Hollywood if you don't like that. And so she winds up doing it. And she goes through this horrible, horrible feeling of boredom, for like a week or something. And then she's suddenly like, oh, wow, this is great. I don't want to do anything other than sit here, just look at the hills and look at the clouds and enjoy this. And Crowley said you would have the earth, the sky, the clouds to entertain you and all that. And so
Hmm.
she slowed down. We could say, and I tend to say it in the books, that what happens is that she slowed down enough for her right brain to kick in, or at least for the left brain to stop interfering with the right brain's input, which the right brain presents us with reality as it is. It just presents it. It's a holistic, global, you know, suchness, I guess, as the Buddhists would say. Whereas left is always, I need to do this and I need to do that. That's survival mode, which we need both. We need both, but we tend to be stuck in the first one all the time. And so I would say all spiritual practices and psychologies are about that. One
Hmm.
swooping general sense, the shifting from this kind of frantic, anxiety-ridden, utilitarian frame of mind, having to deal with everything, and the other just like you become aware of the reality you're just around, you're
That's really
with all the
interesting.
time.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that basically dovetails with where I'm kind of at with I've kind of come to the same conclusion. The way that I've expressed it is that all these spiritual techniques are for getting you out of your sympathetic into your parasympathetic nervous system to be as reductive as humanly possible about it. But I think that's something that can
Mm,
be measured, whether we're talking about, well, maybe not some of the more active stuff, but when you're talking about meditation or what you were
mm,
just describing, slowing down, being in nature. And it seems to, you know, like people just need these decompression times and it's from that when they get back into their kind of native flow. I mean, then all these
mm,
some of these spiritual experiences can sometimes happen, but they're also not the point, I don't think.
mm. But yeah, I mean, I'd say it's increasingly harder and harder to be able
Yeah.
to do that. Um, and on top of the sensory overload that's around us most of the time, if you live in cities, most of us do now. It's all the kind of, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Mental, not quite, but all the stuff on social media,
Yeah.
all this kind of heightened. My God, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time on it, I have to say myself,
That's
but
good.
just recently, I go on to promote. I got a book coming out, blah blah blah. That a couple people I keep in touch with, but I don't know. I mean, and I'm not savvy to all the thing to navigate. Oh, what should I choose on X or whatever it's called now? But this, my God, so much of it was just like
Yeah.
just absolutely rancor ridden. It's like I don't know. It's kind of like recreational hate.
Yeah. 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 I've gotten re-addicted to Twitter. After Elon bought it, I said I'll check this out momentarily, and 2 years later, I'm completely re-addicted to it. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. It's I mean, it's fascinating because it allows you to extend your nervous system into the whole world if you
Mm.
choose, if you use it, if you set it up correctly. But then your body is getting danger signals from all over the planet all at once.
Well, yeah, exactly. And you know, you just have to. I mean, again, you could use that as a kind of exercise. Like whenever you want to comment about something, someone says, "Oh no, I'm not going to."
Oh,
You,
that's
you can
hard.
use,
Yeah.
you can use that as a wake up. So
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. Oh,
no,
that's a good
no,
one. Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
not
I
going
like
to
that.
add. It's not going to add anything. It's not going to add anything. It's. I mean, I don't mean to sound, I don't know, negative or whatever, but it's really not going. It's going to throw another, you know, twig on the fire
Yeah.
basically now. And I mean, I know this sounds quietist, but I think people quietly staying at home and just trying to think, you know, I don't know. I don't want to sound alarmist, but I think we really are heading into like dangerous waters lie ahead.
In what
You know, with
sense?
well, just you know, all the things happening just now. You know, Trump's resurgence,
Hmm.
assassination stuff. Very, very close in France there with
Hmm.
you know, the far right getting, you know, and even here with what's his name, Farage, you know,
Hmm. Hmm.
even though there are hardly any seats, but he's there
But he's
in
there.
Parliament
Yeah.
and he can talk up, you know, anything he wants to say now and all that and so that. So I don't want to get political, but it does strike me as like, oh, I can't believe this is like, and you know, I don't know if anybody's clocked this, but you know, that photo already of, you know, that's gone iconic
The one
Trump
of Trump. Yeah.
and the flag behind. Isn't that Iwo Jima
Yeah, yeah,
2.0?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think yeah, I saw people making that right away. There's definitely a symbolic resonance to that, and also you could say it's like he sacrificed his ear for power, like Odin sacrificed his eye. It's like when these big events happen, it's like
Well,
it's
countrymen,
hard.
lend me your
Oh
ear.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's hard not to read
Has anybody
symbolic
done that?
resonance into
Somebody's got
this.
to do that, right?
Somebody, well, you just did it. Or maybe you're the first. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was just gonna say, like, Twitter for the last 2 days after the assassination attempt has been like peak insanity. People are at their most pompous and self-righteous at the moment on
Oh,
and
God, yeah,
vitriolic. And it doesn't do
yeah.
anything. It's like it's basically a Call of Duty for intellectuals, I guess.
Mm, mm,
But one thing I was going to say, and a meta political point I can make about that is when the Facebook whistleblower came out, I think a couple of years ago. One thing that she said is they know that they're pushing with these. I don't know if this applies to Twitter as much, but they know that
mm,
they're pushing with algorithms more and more rage because it was shown in a study to be the most viral emotion. But what she
mm,
said that's really disturbing is they see that politicians all over the world, it's not just, America or the UK, I mean, it's politicians all over the world are now downstream from social media. So they're having to adopt more and more extreme positions as social
mm,
media pushes people further and further and further into
mm.
rage spirals. So it's like the politicians are caught up in the same feedback loop. And I don't know if there's any way to control that other than top down from these companies. So that's a very, very terrifying thing
Well, it's profitable. I mean, it makes
for
money
them.
basically. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. In the long run, that's if being peaceful and understanding and considerate and patient and laboring to try and really articulate your points through a dialogue made money, then they would do that. But it doesn't.
Right.
So I don't know. It's sad we've devolved into having this kind of conversation about how horrible everything is right now.
Well,
But that's precisely what, you know, with any luck, what these sort of different, whichever different, you know, spiritual or, you know, psychological systems that try to make us more conscious are trying to fight against.
yeah. One other thing that I wanted, when you were talking about, I couldn't help, but when you were talking about people kind of slowing down and taking time out and how that's hard, I mean, I immediately thought about the lockdown period and how that was kind of enforced on everyone. And that didn't necessarily have, I mean, I assume some people took good advantage of that, but I think for the majority of society, that did not, it seems to have just made society 10 times more insane on the other side of it.
Well, I mean, I have to admit to having lockdown nostalgia. I mean, I know the first lockdown here at least. I mean, I don't mean to diminish the, you know, the tragedy many people faced and all that. And
Yeah.
um But here, it was for me, it was more of an inconvenience
Yeah.
than anything else. But it was quiet, there was no traffic. You could hear the birds, and all of that. So, and there was hope here, at least. There was hope here. Oh, gee, isn't can't we keep it like this somehow?
It was
No,
nice,
no, not in
in
the
some
sense of
ways.
like keep a lockdown, but somehow
Right.
see how much more pleasant life is when it's like this.
Right.
We
Well,
don't
in
need to.
Los Angeles, I mean, I was in Los Angeles when lockdown hit, and within like a month or two, it's like there was no smog, everything was green, the clouds were beautiful, the birds were singing, and then, within a year it was looked like Beijing. But
Yeah.
um, I don't leave the house anyways, but for most people, one story I tell a lot is I used to go to a sensory deprivation tank spot in Pasadena called Just Float, which is really good. And one of the people there said something to me. No, this is in LA. This is an entertainment industry city. But one of the
Mm.
people there said to me, a lot of the people who go to that have never been alone by themselves for more than a few minutes. It's like their first time ever sitting with their own thoughts. And P.S. The sample group on this is people who intentionally went to a sensory deprivation tank place. It's not even the
Mm.
general public, which potentially is even less. That was a very, very terrifying comment. And so when we talk about kind of Gurdjieff's idea of people being asleep, yeah, maybe more than ever. But I don't think that
Well,
people responded very well to being to
mm.
forced isolation in the
No, I mean
maybe.
it throws you back on yourself. I mean that's one of the I should say that's one of the classic what do you want to say techniques of getting to know your inner world is to throw yourself into some context where you are alone. And yeah, I mean I remember when it was going on, I was posting like quotes from like the Magic Mountain or something like that. Hans Kaustorp, he's stuck in the tuberculosis clinic in Switzerland. He goes to visit his brother, and he winds up having to stay there because he's got it. And variety. I mean, Wilson's The Outsider, Rilke's Mortlock Briggs, and all the variety of different books about people on their own and all that. And no, some people picked up on it, but I think there's the people already that are doing that. You know what I mean? And again, if I'm going to be hopeful about the future, I tend to think of it in this way, and it's just a metaphor. But we know, okay, quantum entanglement. I know we talk about it all the time, but the two bits of whatever it is, they're together, they're talking to each other, and ooh, they're very far apart, and then they still know what they're each of them is doing, right? And then in the brain, you have different neurons that are not contiguous, they're not next to each other, but they fire at the same time when certain operations or you're doing certain things. So it's not like one neuron next to the other nudging them. They somehow know even though they're not in contact. So I think around the globe, there's people like you and me and others who we don't necessarily know each other. They were not necessarily working in concert consciously in the sense of like, yes, we're all, working on this one thing together. But I'd like to think that our, collective cumulative efforts all together may be moving towards something. Let's hope.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, when the Buddha talks about the Sangha, I mean, that's kind of what, or
Mm.
the Great Light Brotherhood or the Secret
Yeah.
Society, these various metaphors from different traditions. I think that is a real thing. And Rupert Sheldrake says morphogenetic field. I don't know, but
Mm.
certainly I think group consciousness is a measurable phenomenon, and I mean, that's how my entire life has worked. So,
Mm.
I'm a believer that that's a real thing. In fact, at least for me, I don't feel like I could escape it, even if I wanted to.
Mm.
It has that strong of a pull. One person we haven't talked about yet, though, is Swedenborg, who's really interesting, particularly in that he was writing about life, visiting life on other planets and aliens in the 19th century, like just way, way before people were talking about that type of thing.
In the 18th century, actually.
18th, excuse me, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
incredible.
yeah. No, I mean, Swedenborg is a fascinating character. Manuel Swedenborg. He started out as a scientist, not test tube and all that, but in his day, he was up on the latest scientific discoveries in just about everything. He wrote reams about astronomy, and many of the things he wrote about astronomy later were, kind of, yep, he was spot on. He got that. The nebula theory. It seems that he advanced the nebula theory, the formation of the planets, earlier than Kant and Laplace. They're the ones who get it was like a
Wow.
big kind of thing. It gradually spun around and solidified and all that. Um, it was like talking about things like black holes and what
What?
we would call, not in
Wow.
that term, but it was
Wow. And
vortexes of
oh
gravity and
my
things
God.
like that. And then he's talking about something that we would call the anthropic cosmological principle. Um, but and then he wrote lots about the brain. He was talking about the different sides of the brain, well in advance of split brain neuroscience these days. The cerebellum and the difference between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And you mentioned the sympathetic and parasympathetic,
Mm.
nervous systems. I don't know if you know the work of Stan Gooch.
No.
He was a British psychologist, but also paranormal researcher in the 70s and 80s. And he wrote quite a bit about that. He also wrote quite a bit about Neanderthal, and he was laughed at the time for thinking that Cro-Magnon mated with Neanderthal, but now we
Mm.
kind of accept that that was the case. And lots of things he said about Neanderthal, he was laughed at the time, that have
Yeah, you can
since
get
become
your 23andMe results. Will tell you how much Neanderthal you have.
to do that. But then Swedenborg in his and then he was like interested in Freemasonry. He traveled. He met Halley, Edmund Halley, who discovered the comet. God, um, he was an early networker, and what they called an intelligencer. So he traveled around Europe, making contact with other scientists and people, doing the latest research and all that kind of thing. He wrote reams on the anatomy. But then he was involved, and then here in London in the 1740s, something like that, he was involved with the Moravians, who were this group that came out of the Czech Republic following the oh God, the 30 Years War. And it's a long story about that, but they practice a kind of sacred sexuality and a kind of communal love and free love sort of thing. And Swedenborg attended many of their kind of services. And he also studied with a Kabbalist, Rabbi Falk,
Mm-hmm.
um, who Yeats, half tongue in cheek, refers to as one of the unknown superiors or the secret chiefs of the Golden Dawn. And there's actually a real person who actually
Wow.
had
Okay.
a magic shop on the old London Bridge and a Kabbalistic school in the East End.
Huh.
But then in his 50s, Swedenborg, he spent a lot of time in London. He lived here quite a bit. He had this visionary experience where an angel came to him and basically said, give up science. He was trying to find the seat of the soul at the time, following on the work from Rene Descartes, who thought the place where the physical world, the material world, and the mental world, or what he calls, res cogitas and res extensa, the outer world and the inner world meet, is the pineal gland of all
Yeah.
places. So the Hindus, had a march on him there already. But and so Swedenborg was trying to find, yes, okay, where do they come together? They have to in some way. And the angel said, no, give up science. What your real mission is to reveal the true meaning of Scripture. And he had a visitation by Jesus, and then angels started taking him on these trips to heaven and hell
Mm.
and this intermediary world called the spirit world. But he also went to the moon. He went to Venus and Jupiter and Saturn and all these kinds of things. And he wrote these remarkably dull but matter of fact books about all of this. I mean, they're not page turners. They're not sensational in any way.
That's
Just
the most
yes, I
amazing thing of it. I didn't.
yeah.
That's incredible. The fact that they're dull is kind of the most amazing part of that whole story.
Well, I said earlier that he started he wrote this enormous esoteric interpretation of the book of Genesis and Revelation, and this is all based on what he calls correspondences. And this is the notion that everything in the natural world corresponds with something in the spiritual world. So there's an exact meaning for all this stuff. So the simplest one is as the sun gives us its light and its warmth, so the divine gives us its wisdom and its love. So on the physical plane, the sun's light and warmth is corresponds on the spiritual plane to the divine's wisdom and love. So there's various other things like that. And this later on became the basis for the art movement of symbolism. Uh, that happened in the 19th century. So Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, was a reader of Swedenborg,
Oh, I didn't realize that.
and oh yeah, yeah, and he has
Wow.
this
Okay.
this poem about nature as a temple, and how him walking through the wood, and him correspondence has become what we know as synesthesia.
Hmm.
So where we hear colors and we see sounds, where the different senses correspond to each other. So that he kind of took it, the vertical way of seeing it, natural thing, spiritual thing, to like, you know, this sense and that sense and all that. And so, but people like Rimbaud picked up on all that too. So no, but he's really kind of the godfather of symbolism, in the artistic movement, Swedenborg. But he tells he has these little vignettes, sort of to lighten up a little comic interlude, of these long exegesis about the spiritual meaning of scripture. He will tell, oh yes, I was in heaven the other day. I bumped into Saint Paul, and we had this conversation, and we talked, or oh yes, and the angels took me to hell, and it is a truly horrible play, and and all this kind of thing. And but he also displayed remarkable psychic powers.
Hmm.
There's the famous story where he was in a town called Gothenburg, which is like, I don't know how many hours away from Stockholm at the time, but there's no trains or anything, so it was fairly far. And he was at a dinner, and suddenly he stopped, and he said, "Oh my God, a fire has broken out in Stockholm," and he was transfixed, with this vision. And then he was like, "Oh, finally, oh, it stopped just before it got to my house." And it took some time before the fire and news of the fire in Stockholm got to Gothenburg, and his vision was confirmed. And there's another story where he originally wrote his books anonymously, and there were attempts to put him in the madhouse when people discovered that he was the author of this, because he was a member of the Swedish Diet. He was like he was an inspector of mines. He did all this practical, hands-on, heavy duty, what we call businessman industrialist kind of
Hmm.
civic duty sort of thing, on top of visiting heaven and hell, and writing reams about the brain. So I mean, all these people
Wow.
put us to shame.
Yeah.
These
Well, it's
incredible,
because they didn't have cell phones to distract them, probably.
exactly. So, but he has an audience with the Queen of Sweden at the time, and she says, Herr in Swedenborg, I hear that you visit heaven and hell. And if next time you go to heaven, would you mind, saying hello to my brother? I said, of course, madam. And he has another, visitation, audience with her. And she says, he said, yes, Your Highness, I did see your brother. And he asked me to mention this to you. And he walks up to her and he whispers something in her ear. And she's white as a ghost. And, she's in shock. And it's
Wow.
like, no one but God and, myself and my brother know this.
Wow.
So
Wow.
So, I mean, yeah, he was like, and what do you do? I mean, the guy is like brilliant, but he's talking about he's hanging out in heaven and hell and talking to, dead people.
Is there any indication of, was he doing this through dreams or trance states, or does he just say, matter of fact, I went to heaven and spoke to angels, or is there an
Well,
indication of some
there seems to
practice
be
there?
indication that he was able to induce hypnagogic states and stay in them for a long time. This is the in between sleeping and waking. Um, and if you ever can be attentive in those states, you notice that you're still awake, but you see the dreams start to
Hmm.
happen. And I've written about this, and I practice it. It's been better doing it in the morning if you can linger in bed a bit more, rather than trying to stay awake as you fall asleep at night, because you just get a bad night's sleep that way. But if you linger in the morning, or I mean, what I tend to do is and especially now because I tend to be seasonal. So the light comes in early. I wake up early for a bit, and then it's too early to start the day. So I go back to bed for a little bit, an hour or two, and you get into a shallow sleep then. And
Yeah.
the transition in
Yeah.
from the waking into the shallow sleep, you start to, ooh, man, you
Yeah.
start to see, you hear voices saying something to you and all that. So
Do you know
he
about a
seemed to be able to stay in those states for a long period.
do you know about a compound called galantamine?
No, I
Such
never
so
heard
you'll
of
love
that.
this. So this was told. So that state is obviously really interested, a subject of interest for lucid dream
Mm,
researchers. And I spoke to a guy named David Stuckey, who's now sadly passed, who was I think, a psychologist, but he was one of these guys that always needs to go and do the most extreme of everything. So he was into extreme sports and ayahuasca, and I
mm.
think he unfortunately died in a diving, snorkeling, going down too far
Oh
or
no.
something like that. Yeah. But he told me about this. So galantamine is at least this was 10 years ago, but this is what the lucid dream researchers use. And you go to sleep, wake up in the second sleep in the middle of the night, stay awake for about a half an hour. Then you take this substance and go back to sleep. And you have to do exactly what you just said, which is extend that sleep as long as possible. So you can't do this and
Mm.
go to work. And then it hyper amplifies that and puts it into like high definition. You can
No.
get this on Amazon for $10 or
Oh,
something
really?
like
What
that.
is
So
it
yeah,
called again?
galantamine.
Galantamine. All right, I have to
Yeah.
look for that.
So I recommend. It's been maybe 10 years, but I did this and verified it, and yeah, it definitely works. So it's kind of like the shortcut for if anyone's interested, the shortcut into lucid dream states. It's
Mm.
pretty nuts. But if you wake yourself up early instead of sleeping in as much as possible, you get unbelievably sick. Not in a dangerous way, but in
Mm.
a very unpleasant way.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Well, again, it's Swedenborg, and he wrote quite a bit. I mean, we were talking about Nicoll's diaries earlier, and Swedenborg also kept a dream diary. And he too had a great many erotic dreams and what we would call rather transgressive and repugnant sorts of dreams and all that. And he was interpreting them along sort of Freudian lines, well in advance of Sigmund. And yeah, it's and he actually charts like different levels of consciousness is the waking state, and then he would say this kind of like this in between realm, and then the deep sleep, you get the deep dreams. But he said the most blessed of all is that when you wake up early and you can linger for like an extended there, and he says like that's when I would hear the angels talking to me and
That's what
things
Swedenborg
things of
said.
that. So yeah, Swedenborg's saying that. So
Okay,
that's this kind, yeah.
interesting.
And he also had this interesting idea that he talks about sort of an evolution of consciousness in the sense that he said originally the cerebellum was the main brain, and this and the way the divine somehow communicated us was like through the back of the head. And this is why in heaven no angel stands behind another angel. So they're not they're never like that. They're always,
Huh.
it's because you don't want to block the divine influx coming in. And interesting, I mentioned this fellow Stan Gooch and his writing about the Neanderthals. He said Neanderthal had a much bigger cerebellum than Cro-Magnon cerebrum, and he believed the cerebellum was the seat of sort of psychic, phenomena and experiences and things of that sort. And Swedenborg actually recounted that he actually felt his cerebellum. We don't feel the brain has no sensory. So there's famous stories of people having their brain operated on that they're not anesthetized. Just the brain doesn't feel any pain. But somehow Swedenborg was talking about how he could actually feel his cerebellum, and it's a little brain, and below, and this is there's the what they call the limbic system, the reptilian brain, um, which may perhaps all these ideas of like fighting off the reptile people or the
I've thought
earlier
about that a
lizard
lot. Yeah,
people
yeah, yeah,
might
yeah,
very well be some vestigial sense of this earlier, Paul MacLean's idea of the three brains is like he
yeah.
said, whenever you go to a psychiatrist and you lie down on the couch, you're sharing it with a horse and an alligator. So there's a mammal brain, there's a reptilian brain, and then there's the cerebrum, which is the human one,
Hmm.
the conscious and all that kind of stuff, rational decision. And but the original cerebellum was one of the ones that was around for the longest time. And this is an idea of Arthur Kessler. Nobody reads him anymore, but I think he was an important writer in the last century. And he wrote a remarkable book called Ghost in the Machine in the 60s. And he basically says what's happened to human beings and why everything's a mess is that evolution, just made a mistake here. And instead of integrating the cerebrum with the cerebellum, it just laid it on top of it. So it's not like integrated
Huh.
as one unit, just like plop. You had this one thing which was developing, and then now boom, that was just like the brain explosion, and suddenly you get the frontal lobes and all that. But they're just kind of like plopped on top of the earlier brain, and they fight. They fight, and so we, are that's why we're subject to these emotional rages and kind of thing. And he proposed a drug to deal with this well in advance of whatever Prozac was. He didn't name it. He said there must be some kind of we must be able to come up with some kind of pharmaceutical that would help integrate these two, the old brain and the new brain sort of
Hmm.
thing. So
Is that how SSRIs work?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't either. Um, I'm curious. I mean, like in all of your research and reading about this stuff, do you have what do you have theories about why these states are available to some people? I mean, in the class, Colin Wilson says faculty X. Why are these things available to some people and not others? And obviously there are techniques you can do to catalyze them, whether it's drugs or these
Hmm.
yogic techniques or anything like that. But I feel that even with those, it takes somebody already being interested in that type of thing to go and seek that out.
Yeah. Well,
So,
there's a difference between being interested and being able to. I think we're
and
all
that also, yeah.
I think they're all we all have access to them, or they're there. I think they're just part of our being. It's what happens, but great many of us don't pay attention to them, or we just whatever you have, I mean, faculty X is uh a sense of the reality of other times and places, right? So we're here now, you're there in Texas, I'm here in London, and I'm occupying this space and time. Um, and I know I used to live in Los Angeles, let's say. But something might happen. And again, we're going back to this notion of imagination has the power to realize some smell, I don't know, something might remind me that suddenly, you have that Proustian moment where it's like, yeah, I remember what it's like living in
Right,
LA,
right,
this
right, right.
smell of the pavement, and all that kind of thing. So it's not just the knowledge. So I think we all have that. Wilson, myself, and I suspect you and other people, we want to like, well, what what's going on then when that
Right.
happened? So I think that's the other interest. What determines whether you take an interest in it and whether you want to pursue it or not? Well, there's whole different factors are involved in that. But I don't think these kind of experiences are only select people can get them, only some kind of elite. I think it's
Mhm.
no, we all have them. We all have moments. Again, we all have the moment when we've seen a leaf for the first time. I don't care what you say consciously. We've all had the moment where like, and oh, I remember, yes, this was like when I was a kid. Yeah. And there's a wonderful, I don't know if you know Dostoevsky's novel, The Possessed. It's also
I haven't
translated as
read
The
it, no.
Devils.
Mm-mm.
Okay, and there's a character named Kirillov in it. And he's obsessed with the notion of freedom. And he wants to prove that, he's absolutely free. And sadly, the only thing he can think of doing to prove he's absolutely free is to blow his brains out because it's the completely irrevocable act that he can make. But before then, he has these moments. What I call them the all is good moment. And there's one where he sees a leaf and he's talking to the character, Steve Rogan, who commits suicide as well, but for different reasons. So many people, these novels commit suicide.
It's
But
very
in any case,
Russian.
even though he has his all is good, but that's the
It's
contrast. He
still Russian at
contrasts
the end
these
of the day.
characters that like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and Kirillov says, have you ever seen a leaf? A leaf from the tree. Stavrogan says, what is this, a sermon? He says, no, it's not a sermon. It's just a leaf. I
Hmm.
saw one the other day. It was yellow, a little brown at the edges. I could see the sunlight coming through the veins. I remember looking at a leaf when I was a child. We're all happy. We're all happy. And Stavrogan says, when did you know you were happy? I looked at the clock. It was 24 minutes past 3 or something like that. But it's this kind of matter of fact conversation. But Kirillov is basically saying the basic thing. He's like, we just don't see what's in front of us. And this comes out of Dostoevsky's own experience when he was arrested as an early student, radical, and he was in the Semyonovsky Square and he was about to be executed with his fellows. And they didn't know there was a reprieve, but they were set up, ready to be shot. They had the white shirts on and all that kind of thing.
That'll
And
get your mind
Dostoevsky
right.
looks over at his comrades and all. Well, so they know whether you're hit. They see the blood. And he looks at his comrades and he looks over and he looks at the world and he says, "My God, I would do anything to be able to, not die.
Mm.
Everything is poignantly beautiful, precious." And then they they announce a reprieve, and one of his companions went mad, went insane out of that.
Huh.
But that moment when Dostoevsky saw, like on just on the the brink of death, the utter poignancy and absolute worthwhileness of life, that informed he tries to get to that in his novels. But it is that moment. We've all had that moment. And I had that moment. I was doing these work exercises,
Hmm.
and you can have them on drugs and all that. But the best time is when you just turn your head and you look over and it just happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that,
That's the best time. And that's when you're just, that's how we should be,
yeah.
basically.
Can you have them on drugs? Because you know, with drugs, it's like, yeah, you can have a moment of lucidity, but it's like wedged in between 6 hours of neurological noise, as Ken Wilber called it once, and it's like,
Mm.
um,
Well, I mean, a puff of
and
cannabis
and you,
doesn't necessarily do
oh,
that,
well, that's not a drug.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I say like
But
wine. I
yeah.
mean, wine is
Oh,
poetry in a
yeah, yeah,
bottle.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Wine is poetry in a bottle. I mean, why did Baudelaire and so many other poets, they're always drinking wine. They drink suddenly something that was boring is, oh, that's very interesting.
I suppose I was thinking of
And again, it
psychedelics.
sounds like, oh, you're only saying that because you're drunk. But no, what's happening is that you've used crude means to put your ever alert, hyperactive, utilitarian mind to rest for a little
Yeah,
while.
parasympathetic.
Because we're always around. What do I got to deal with this? Got to deal with that. Got to deal with this. Got to deal with that. Everything. Just stop that for a while, and then I mean, it just sounds ridiculous, sounds cliche, but it's really true. That's really what it's about.
I think that's why a lot of people smoke also. I mean, I had a conversation once, um, or actually, no, I'm sorry, Genesis related this to me, that she was talking to somebody about why they smoked, and they said, it's so that I can stop time for 5 minutes and just appreciate a sunset. It's like a break. That makes perfect sense. And I suppose
I
this is
think.
what people
Oh,
are trying to
okay.
do with little, mindfulness now. But that's just become,
Hmm. Hmm.
also a tool to get people. It's very corporate and all of that. But I was struck by that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah, everything becomes corrupted, and part of it. You can't. It's hard. I mean, one of the things about the Gurdjieff work is I think they keep a low profile, and they don't advertise, and they don't seek followers. The ones that are advertising on the net places, they're not the real thing. They don't do that. So you actually got to, and this is like going back to the early days. You actually had to go out of your way to try and find them, and it was made difficult for you to do that. So you really, really have to want it, as the Spice Girls used to say. You must really, really want it, and then there's some, not like trials tribulations, but you just sort of, it's not like, oh yeah, fine, just sign here and now you're a member of the
Right,
club or
right,
something.
right,
So
right.
um I respect them for that, because they're trying to keep, these ideas that are important, not watered down and not just part of the whole kind of flux out there. Um
Do you find them to be culty at all?
well, I mean, my experience is 40 years ago. So I don't know today. I've had close friends that are involved in it for a long time, and even though I've written a book about Uspensky and now Nicoll in it, but I've never been asked to address any kind of Gurdjieff or Fourth Way group, whereas I've given talks to Swedenborg Society and Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophical, groups, and Crowley groups, and Jung, and in fact everybody else. So um, it all depends on, I mean, all these things. You have the founders, the initial ones, and what tends to happen is the second, third, whatever, ever by now generation. It's not the same thing,
Mhm.
and you get, the followers tend to be more royal than the king, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
They tend to stick to the letter of the law more
Yeah.
than, and the originals wouldn't necessarily have done that because
Right.
they had the mana, they had the creative energy. They could change. This is how it is, and so
Yeah.
that's the impression I get. Well, I think that's true of a lot of these groups. I mean, and I also think a lot of them are ossifying, so they're not getting young people. I mean, I have no idea what so-called young people these days are interested in terms to any kind of spiritual or
I mean,
something.
I
I
think
suspect it's psychedelics or
psychedelics and Crowley is forever,
yeah, yeah.
popular for
It's fun.
people.
It's sex and
Yeah,
drugs and
yeah,
rock and roll.
right. But in terms of, I don't know if there's a Zoomers for Swedenborg type thing going on. That would be funny though. Um, well, so we should, I guess, bring it back to Nicoll. And how do you feel? Do you feel that he synthesized all these things, and did his sexual methods play a part in it?
Well, I don't think he set out to consciously synthesize it, but if you are familiar with Jung's ideas and familiar with Swedenborg's ideas, and you read Nicoll's psychological commentaries on the teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, you'll find in there Jungian and Swedenborgian motifs mixed in. And I mean, that's another thing. Like, oh, what's the echt, real, genuine Gurdjieff teaching? So that's another psychodrama throughout the history of it. So
Mm.
there's Gurdjieff taught, then Ouspensky had his own version of it, and then he was accused of stealing Gurdjieff's ideas, and all this kind of stuff goes on. So there is a kind of purist strain that tries to keep it as closely to what I understand what Gurdjieff left behind. But then there's the other branches like the Ouspensky and Nicoll, although he spent time with Gurdjieff and Fontainebleau, the longest and closest contact he'd have with Ouspensky. And Ouspensky wasn't the crazy guru. He wasn't like that. He was a very kind of, he was almost like a logician, kind of
Mm.
strict taskmaster. And it was more trying to, he didn't do all the stop and all the movements, any of that kind of stuff. It was more basically grasping the ideas and a variety of different psychological exercises, self-remembering, self-observation, things of that sort. So Nicoll came out of that. But he did incorporate a lot of the hands-on sort of thing. He did a lot of arts and crafts stuff and people and music. And so he was using things of that sort to get people to, pay attention to what they were doing and make efforts to be awake. But if his background, you can see. So he things that we would consider kind of shadow language about, if you see characteristics in a person that particularly you find kind of repugnant, well, you should look for them in yourself and that kind of thing. And even though love and wisdom are words we use all the time, they have a peculiarly Swedenborgian meaning to them, and in the context of the commentary he uses them like that. And later on, I mean, they I think they start up in the early 40s and they end just before he dies in the early 50s. So gradually over time the the references become less and less veiled. It becomes a bit more, and he also incorporates hermetic ideas.
Okay.
He was a reader of the Hermetica. He was a reader of the Gnostics, and the whole idea. Well, there's a central theme in the work, and it's distinction Gurdjieff makes between what he calls essence and personality. And we can see it similarly to what this distinction Jung makes between the self and the persona. So for Gurdjieff, essence is what you are truly yours. It's what you're born with. The personality is something you acquire dealing with the world and imitating people and picking up things and things of that sort. And so Jung would say the self is not the ego. The self is the deeper, realer self. The persona is this face we develop in order to deal with it's the face that we put on to deal with the faces we will meet. So that kind of thing from the old Greek, the mask that the actors had. So it's similar there. So the Gurdjieff work would be to somehow we start with essence and then we're young, but then by the time we start to become self-aware, essence starts to cringe a bit, and personality takes over, and we
Yeah.
adopt lots of different things around people in order to deal with stuff. And the whole
Right.
idea is somehow to make that passive so that essence can come out. And in a very interesting way, I mean, in this lecture, insofar as a lecture Gurdjieff gave here in London in 1922 or something like that, when he first came, and when Nicoll first saw him and then decided to go to the institute, he said essence and personality are in two different parts of the brain. And there wasn't much about split brain psychology then. Actually, Nicoll starts reading about it in the 50s, just before he dies. And he makes the link between the difference between the right and left side. And he says, you know, the right side is the more conscious everyday side, and that's connected to the left brain. The left side is the inner man. It's the and that's the right brain kind of thing. And so you can see essence as right brain and personality as the left brain kind of thing. I don't want to reduce into that, but it's another way to kind of
Right.
understand it and to see it. And so the one of the aims of this work is to somehow, you know, as we've been saying, slow down, quiet down the personality
Right.
to allow the essence just to come out, that kind of thing. So this was something
Interesting.
that I think became a sort of speciality of Nicoll.
Yeah, maybe just
I was just
maybe
going to say I never
go
got
ahead.
around to saying why it's called the fourth way,
Okay, yes.
the teaching, and the reason it's called the fourth way is that well, Gurdjieff said there were like three traditional ways of spiritual development, let's say. And the first is the fakir. So this is the fellow who lies on the bed of nails or stays in the same position, you know, for hours on end, starves himself. So this is control of the body. So somebody who spends too much time at yoga class or in the gym today might be, you know, the fakir. And then there's the monk, which would be the development of the emotions, and the devotional, like bhakti yoga, something like that, devotional practice. So someone like you know, Ramana Harshi, who Sri Ramana Harshi, who uh, uh, just at the sound of the name of Kali, the Divine Mother, he would go into a swoon. You know, so his devotion towards her was so strong. And the other end was the way of the mind, so the yogi, this concentration, dhyana, meditation, and then, you know, rising on the plains and things of that sort. And they each have their own virtues, but the problem with each one is that they leave out the other two.
Hmm.
So the fakir has control of the body, but he has no control of his emotions, and, you know, can't think his way out of a Ziploc bag. And then the you know, the monk has power, you know, with his emotions, but he's useless with his body, and again doesn't think very well. And the yogi, um, we know, is, you know, hasn't the slightest idea what to do with his emotions, and has no control of his body. So the fourth way, Gurdjieff said, was his method, was what he called the way of the sly man, and was a way of working on all three of those things at the same time. And this was something that he was doing at the priory, at the institute, where he would develop these different exercises where you were working physically, dealing with your emotions, mostly in the sense that he would create these situations where there would be purposeful friction. So he would put people together whom he knew would not get along, and they would create these kind
Interesting.
of uncomfortable
Interesting. Okay.
situations, and they'd have
Okay.
to deal with that. And there'd be a variety of different sort of mental exercises, like self-remembering and things of that sort. And the reason why Nicoll was attracted to this, and he even says this in this Dear Carl letter he writes to Jung, when he's telling Jung that I'm changing my allegiance. You know, you've meant a lot to me. You know, you've taken me very far, but I basically need somebody to force me to do this kind of work. And but he thought Jung left too much for him to deal with himself. He said, well, here's the method, here's the technique, here's the ideas. This is, you know, what we're aiming at, in the variety of, you know, Jungian ideas about the unconscious and things of that sort. And you can see in these diaries that Nicoll is, you know, assiduously applying these Jungian techniques to try and understand his dreams, but just, it's like, did it mean that? Did it mean this? I don't know. Did it mean? So he's kind of like, and he must have talked with Jung about this, because he even records that Jung said to him that you're trying too hard.
Hmm.
You're trying too hard to try and, you know, get it. And what he was attracted to with Uspensky, because the whole how he even found out about Ouspensky is itself this fantastic adventure story because, I mean, Gurdjieff appears. Ouspensky was a well-known journalist and writer and lecturer on theosophical and cult and mystical kind of themes in St. Petersburg and Moscow in the early 20th century. And then he went on what he called his search for the miraculous. This was later became the title of his book about his years with Gurdjieff. But this was an actual journey he went on to India and Ceylon and Egypt. And he talks about standing in front of the Sphinx and the pyramids and all this. And he believed that because before he met Gurdjieff, he himself wrote this fantastic book called Tertium Organum, means the third organ of thought. And it's this metaphysical fireworks display of spectacle thought about higher consciousness and higher dimensions and things of that sort. So he was aware of all this stuff, and he believed there were schools somewhere that still existed where you could learn, you could be taught how to achieve these kinds of states. So he went in search of that, but he came back empty-handed, and he was actually quite kind of disillusioned about all this sort of stuff. And he's giving a lecture about his journeys, his search for miraculous. And Gurdjieff had already developed like a little group around him, but he wasn't known. And he sent out some of his students to snare. He wanted to snare Ouspensky in the same way that Madame Blavatsky purposely sought out Colonel Olcott. Mm. If you know the story when she winds up in New York, and well, she winds up in New York and she's reading about Colonel Olcott, who's this Civil War veteran and journalist, and he's been writing a series of articles about this haunting in a place in Vermont, in Chittenden. And Blavatsky has this whole, history behind her of being in seances and spiritual groups in different parts of the world. And so, but she seeks him out because he turns out to be a very, very good front man for her. And Ouspensky is the same thing. So Gurdjieff needed a good lieutenant. He needed a good front man. And so he sought Ouspensky out. Ouspensky said, look, I've just come from my search for miraculous. I'm not interested in gurus. And these people kept pestering him. Finally, he said, okay, I'll go and meet this person. And when he meets them, he's actually quite impressed. And he believes Gurdjieff is the man who knows.
Okay.
He's the one who has the knowledge that he has sought. And he's not found it in this romantic backdrop of the pyramids or the Taj Mahal, but he's found it in this cheap cafe in the back street in Moscow.
Yeah, that's how it works, I guess.
Yeah, and he's very impressed with him. And so for the next 5 years or so, he and a small group become Gurdjieff students, but what's happening is you have World War I happening, that breaks out, then the Bolshevik Revolution, then the Civil War, and so we have a collapsing Russia, and Gurdjieff, Ouspensky and the band of followers are funneled across, an exploding country down to Constantinople at the time. And I mentioned this book, Tertium Organum, Ouspensky's. Unbeknownst to him, it's appeared in an English translation in America, and it's become a bestseller. He doesn't know it's become a bestseller, and publishers are trying to get in touch with him, frantically trying to get in touch with him. And one of its readers is a woman here in London named Lady Rothermere, and she's the wife of a newspaper baron. So think, she's the wife of Rupert Murdoch or something like that. Think like that. And she's what we would call, a kind of mind, body, spirit, devotee, and she wants to meet him. So she finds out that he's in this White Russian refugee camp in Constantinople. She manages to get a telegram to him and said, I must meet you. Money, no object, London, New York. He says, London. So he's taken, talk about search and miraculous. He's taken out of this White Russian refugee camp, plopped down in London, and he's giving these lectures in fashionable St. John's Wood. And at the time, people like T.S. Eliot and Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, Algernon Blackwood, A.E. Waite, and others, and other people, at the time, well-known literary luminaries, are attending these lectures. But Ouspensky is not giving a lecture about the ideas in Tertium Organum. He's giving a lecture about Gurdjieff's austere system, basically saying, everyone in this room is asleep. Mm-hmm. Everyone in this room is mechanical. And it's many people get up and, oh, this isn't what I came here for. But it electrifies Nicoll because it's this kind of austere, demanding, rugged kind of teaching that he feels that he needs.
That's great. Yeah, that makes me so that makes me think of something that maybe is a good point to draw to a close on, which is you've mentioned all of these horrible wars that were going on, and we've talked a little bit about the current state of the world and how perhaps people are more asleep than ever. And a couple of points that have come to me through this conversation. One is, yeah, everyone is asleep in Gurdjieff's sense, and more than ever. But now it's because of social media, because of phones and the internet. It's not just that they're asleep; it's they are manipulatable in real time by governments all over the world, not just their own, but foreign influence operations that can move them in different ways without them being conscious of it. And we're seeing quite a lot of that right now. And that leads me on to thinking, I believe Gurdjieff said, either Gurdjieff or Ouspensky said at some point, that in these moments of cataclysm, which are basically just sleeping people being mashed against each other, that the way through is to wake up, and that if you're awake, you don't have to participate. You can almost like walk around it or walk through it, and that's maybe a point worth bringing out at the current moment.
I would certainly endorse that. Yeah, I mean, you can be an internal exile, in the sense that you're here, or the old Sufi saying, or Christian, you're in the world but not of it.
Mm-hmm.
But inescapably here, we can't get away, but we don't have to participate. And even back then, one of Gurdjieff's students, there was a fellow named Thomas de Hartmann, who was a composer, and he was conscripted into the Russian army, and he didn't want to go, but he had to go. If he didn't go, he would have been arrested. And Gurdjieff said, "Go, but don't howl with the rules." So if you have to go, go, but you don't have to participate completely in it. And even that itself, just that whole, that separation, that inner separate. That's one of the objects of the work too. This kind of inner separation. You maintain sense of yourself inwardly, even though you're in the world all the time. You're not in an ashram. You're not in the zendo. You're not up in the mountains. You're in the supermarket. You're in traffic. You're whatever. You're at the doctor's, wherever you are. But you try to maintain some inner, that's self-remembering, this inner sense of distance, separation from what's out there. So you're not just caught up in the flow of everything. And I would say, my God, yeah, be aware of it, but don't participate. Like I said before, when you have that urge to comment, guy's a jerk, don't do it.
I'm gonna have to work
Just
on that, Gary.
don't do it.
That's gonna be my practice
They're all
now.
jerks. They're all jerks, but you'll just be another jerk that some other jerk will
Yeah,
say that guy's a jerk about.
yeah.
So, I mean, it's easier said than done, but it's what Gurdjieff would call an alarm clock. It's an alarm clock. Every time you want to do, oh, I'm not going to do that.
I'm gonna work on
You know,
that.
you know,
That's a good one.
Crowley had that thing where you slash yourself.
Yeah, that's a
With the
good one. I've
razor.
done that, by the way, several times. It's and you
Well,
have
when
to.
I when
Yeah,
I when I had my brief tenure with the O2, we could cheat. We just had to put a rubber band around ourselves.
I've done the rubber band, but I have to
It's not.
say, with the razor, you have to. The rubber band's good to practice, but maybe I shouldn't say this on the podcast.
Oh no, I'm sure. I'm sure.
But
No,
yeah,
you don't have to.
once it's the razor, then you really now you're at attention because you
Yeah,
really don't want to
yeah,
have to do that.
yeah. So I mean, but again, use your imagination. Use your imagination. Realize, focus, and realize. It's hard to do because I feel it myself. Oh, gee, I should be in there. I wrote a book about Trump. I've written a book about Russia. Shouldn't I be making all these comments? And I think, well, what am I going to say? I it's in one sense, I feel at a loss for words because I said before, like we're really heading into dangerous waters, and I'm half. Well, I always thought when the excrement hit the air conditioner,
Uh-huh.
if I may put it that way, I'd be too old to do much anything about it. So just have to somehow ride out the storm.
Well, we'll see
So
what happens. It's a good time to maintain wakefulness, though. That's for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah. So where can people get your books and tell them
Well,
about the
they're
latest one that you
online.
have?
I don't know where you can get them in Texas. I have this
Yeah, of
website.
course. Texas is an awesome book state. We have this thing called Half Price Books, which is the
Oh,
greatest
really?
bookstore ever.
Oh,
There's nine
fantastic.
bookstores in Austin alone, just constantly cycling some of the
Wow.
greatest stuff you've ever seen. But yeah, Texas is a huge reader state.
Well, I think the one time I was in Austin was when I was playing in a rock band ages ago. I
Mhm.
played with Iggy Pop, and we were there. We played
That's
there.
awesome.
It's a long time ago. But no, I mean, you can get them online, get it at all good bookstores, and or even the bad bookstores. You know.
Hmm.
So yeah. So well, thanks a lot
Thank
for having
you.
me on, Jason. I appreciate it, and
Me too.
yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you again.